Thank you for joining us for today's EPA's Tools and Resources webinar on air sensor performance. Today's webinar will highlight two new reports developed by EPA on air performance testing for ozone and fine particulate matter air sensors. The reports are the first consistent testing protocols to uniformly evaluate air sensors, which have increased in popularity to measure local air quality. They were developed to provide guidance to testers on how to appropriately evaluate air sensor technologies and help consumers understand air sensor performance. If you have a science question during or after the presentation, please type it into the Q&A window at any time. And once the presentation ends, we will go through as many questions as time allows. You can listen through your computer speakers, and we will post today's PowerPoint presentation on our EPA research website and follow that up with a recording. And I believe Aaron has typed that address into the Q&A pod. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Watkins. Tim is the director of EPA ORD's Center for Environmental Measurement and Modeling, to introduce today's webinar and our presenters. Tim?
Great. Hi, thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. Yes, hello everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce today's webinar and today's speakers. As Lisa said, my name is Tim Watkins, and I'm the director of ORD's Center for Environmental Measurement and Modeling. And this topic is one that's near and dear to my heart. I really it's been a high priority focus for our research program, that is air sensor technology, for several years, and we're making great progress thanks to our tremendous scientists working on this issue. I think, as many of you know, lower cost sensors, air sensor technologies have flooded the marketplace and are being rapidly adopted by a variety of users for a variety of purposes. But it's commonly known that the data quality from these technologies can be variable, highly variable in some cases. And in addition, consistent testing protocols and target values have not been available to evaluate and compare the different technologies and to understand their performance, particularly in real world conditions. And as a result, in some cases, there's a lack of confidence in data quality and in selecting sensors that are best suited for certain applications. So to address this issue, we've been partnering, being EPA and our research scientists in particular, have been partnering with state air monitoring agencies to evaluate and compare sensor performance to regulatory approved monitors, and also hosted workshops on these topics with states, tribes, communities, developers, and so forth. And so, as Lisa said, today's webinar is going to highlight two recently released reports that outline recommended performance testing protocols, metrics, and target values for fine particles and ozone. So with that, I will now like to introduce our presenters today, who are two scientists that work within our Center for Environmental Measurement and Modeling. The first speaker who will kick us off will be Dr. Rochelle Duval, who's the lead for these particular efforts. And then Dr. Duval will be joined on the webinar by Dr. Andrea Clemens. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rochelle. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, for the introduction. And I just want to welcome everyone again to the webinar. Thank you for joining today. And as mentioned, we'll be providing an overview of our work on developing air sensor performance testing protocols, metrics, and target values for PM2.5 and ozone air sensors. I do want to acknowledge my co-presenter, Andrea Clements, and also all of the contributors on these reports. We had a pretty large group that contributed or either wrote sections, also reviewers for this, so I do want to extend my appreciation to them. So as an overview of what will be presented today, we'll start out with some background on air sensors. I'll also talk about the motivation for this work. I'll go through our problem statement and impact. I'll talk about our approach for developing these reports. I'll also give an overview of the reports. We'll talk about anticipated outcomes, take-home messages, our future work that's planned, resources, and then end with contact information. So as a background of air sensors, we refer to air sensors as non-regulatory technologies that measure air quality. And this term describes an integrated set of hardware and software that often uses more than one or more, sensing components to measure pollutants or detect pollutants. And when we look at the general features of air sensors, they tend to be lower in cost, they're more portable, and they're easier to operate than regulatory monitors. And they normally provide relatively quick or instant measurements. And because of their size and lower costs, they can allow for data collection in more locations. And what we're seeing is that air sensors have really encouraged innovation in air monitoring approaches. There is definitely more interest in using these devices to measure air quality. So both the availability and use of air sensors has dramatically increased over the years. As Tim mentioned, we see sensors continuing to flood the market and their use continues to grow. And there's a broad user community with varying levels of experience from very novice users to more advanced technical users. Just some examples are citizen scientists, individuals, cities and communities, schools, there's air quality and health agencies, medical professionals, and many, many more. The applications of these are quite variable as well, and they also continue to expand. And some examples of applications include looking at air quality trends, whether this be daily or long-term, supplemental monitoring, air quality forecasting, citizen science, education and environmental awareness, and again, many, many other examples. These are just a few here. And while air sensors are creating more opportunities to measure air quality, there are several challenges with these devices. And this work that we're presenting today was motivated by three main drivers, and these all have a general theme, and that's related to understanding sensor performance. So the first motivator is that there are routine sensor evaluations, but these are very limited. Also, as we look across the evaluations that we have available, the sensor data quality is highly variable. And lastly, in general, there is a need and desire for a consistent set of performance testing protocols, metrics, and targets to evaluate air sensors. So in the next few slides, I'll go through and talk a little bit more about these motivators in detail. So when we're looking at routine sensor evaluations, these are pretty limited, and there are a number of organizations that conduct routine evaluations, so US EPA being one of them. Our friends at Air Quality, AccuSpec, which is the Air Quality Sensor Performance Evaluation Center out of California, and others also conduct routine sensor evaluations. And one thing to note is these evaluations are similar, but they're not identical in how testing is done. And we also know there are limitations of these evaluations. So when we take a look at where these evaluations occur, so we have a site on our campus in North Carolina where we do our routine evaluations. AccuSpec normally performs their evaluations at air monitoring sites. You can see a picture there of a Rubidoux air monitoring site. But these locations are not widespread. The environmental conditions are limited, and the challenge is that these results may not translate for other locations and conditions where maybe pollutant levels may be different, or it may be colder temperatures or warmer temperatures. So one thing that we've also seen with our routine evaluations is that we can test the same device and we still see a lot of variability. And this is based on the sensor make and model. It's also based on temperature, relative humidity, and season. And some of the impact is that when we're looking at these evaluation results, there are questions on how do we interpret this? We being the experts and others, how do we interpret the results? And it's also difficult when we think of consumers who would like to purchase sensors for them to predict how the sensors may perform in their location, especially if pollutant levels are much higher or lower, or the environmental conditions, maybe temperature outside, relative humidity is much different. So the next driver is, sensor data quality is highly variable. And there's a number of key challenges related to sensors that are affecting the performance and also our understanding and data quality. So One of them first is the ability to measure a pollutant of interest. So can a sensor measure a pollutant of interest accurately and reliably at an expected concentration range for the application of interest? We also know that performance under different environmental conditions is different among sensors. So things like relative humidity and temperature, pollutant concentrations can impact sensor measurements. There's also the ability to measure a target pollutant in a mixture of pollutants. We know that some sensors, if they're measuring a target pollutant, they can be impacted by interfering compounds in the air. So that's something that's very important and challenging to understand. Also, performance over time. We know that their response and ability to measure pollutants can change over time, and sometimes sensors or readings become inaccurate or unreliable, and having that information is really critical. Also, performance out of the box is important. A lot of users will take the sensors and want to deploy them, and we need to understand, how do they perform out of the box? Are there any corrections or adjustments that are needed to provide more accurate data quality? And with the variability in data quality, the impact of this is there's a general lack in confidence in data quality, and also a general confusion as users don't know which sensor will appropriately fit their desired application. The last motivator for this work is a general need for consistent performance testing protocols, metrics, targets for sensors. And under the Clean Air Act, for compliance with the NAAQS, monitoring instruments have to meet applicable requirements. These are in CFR. You can see the parts and title there. And instruments that are used for this purpose, the requirements are very strict because that data has to be highly accurate and of high quality for compliance monitoring. And we recognize that sensors will probably not meet those requirements, but what is there available that can help us evaluate sensors? And a challenge has been that there are not consistent testing protocols that are available to evaluate and compare different technologies. Another challenge is that as we look across our evaluation results, there are different data quality parameters, which we call performance metrics, that are used to summarize sensor performance evaluations. Additionally, there are no targets, performance targets, or testable metrics that are available. And this is important because it gives an indication of how good an instrument is. And the impact of that is there is a general confusion on what procedures are needed to evaluate sensors. It's also extremely hard to compare sensor performance if the testing protocols are different and also different data quality metrics are reported. And then lastly, not having that target or benchmark to guide technology improvements is challenging, as it's something that can help make sensors better and also drive changes in the market. So just summarizing the problem and impact, understanding sensor performance and how technologies compare is really, really important, but it's challenging. And when we think about decision makers, it's very difficult to respond to data if you don't know what the quality is. And a common question is, how can we trust or interpret this data without having that understanding of the data quality? It's also very hard to inform decisions if the data quality is unknown. And just given the lack of understanding of sensor performance, if the public is bringing data to a decision maker, it could potentially be disregarded based on quality issues. And if you think about the time spent collecting data, and let's say a user doesn't understand or know that this instrument does not perform well, or that it's not designed for an application of interest, then if those efforts are disregarded, it can be quite frustrating. And unfortunately, there's also potential for public distrust or lacking confidence in decision makers. And again, this stems just from a general lack of understanding of sensor performance from all stakeholders. So considering these issues and many other issues, we wanted to figure out if we, EPA, could provide some type of guidance to help address these issues. And if we could, what would that guidance look like? So as we started on this journey in developing testing protocols, our first initial approach was gathering available information and also hearing from experts. So the first thing we did was we reviewed published peer-reviewed literature. This was focusing on performance attributes that characterize instruments used to monitor air pollutants. So we looked across all programs, so regulatory, non-regulatory, to see what types of attributes were being reported. We looked at US and also worldwide as well to inform this. We also looked at quantitative performance metrics that describe performance attributes. And we're also very interested in looking at field and laboratory sensor performance evaluations, looking at those results, looking at the metrics, attributes, different things that were reported. And if interested, our first literature review and second literature review is available online, and you can find those on those links on this slide. So the second step was that in coordination with ECOS, we hosted a workshop in 2018, which was the Deliberating Performance Targets for Air Quality Sensors workshop. And for this workshop, we convened a panel of experts in air quality monitoring, regulatory work, air sensors, and these came from regulatory agencies, academia, and international organizations. The workshop was attended by states, tribes, federal agencies, academics, sensor manufacturers, international group. Many people attended. We had over 700, both in person and on webinar. And I did want to mention that we had a lot of state representation during these workshops. On the panel, there were a little over 20% representation, experts from states and tribes, and attendees were about 25% from states and tribes. And for these particular workshops, we gathered perspectives on the state of sensor technologies, on potential approaches for setting performance targets and standards. And also, we were interested in hearing from other organizations as others are approaching and looking at establishing similar types of protocols for sensors. And if you're interested, the workshop website is listed on the bottom of this slide. So from the workshop, we've identified several possible actions. First was documenting best practices, and this is related to operation and maintenance of sensors. Another action was sharing quality assurance results and sensor data, and this is to better understand the data itself and processing and some of the results from that. And lastly, there was general support to develop common performance lexicon, performance targets, and test protocols. We have a journal article that was published that summarizes that work if interested, and the link is there. So using all of this information, workshops, our literature reviews, our strategy for developing these reports was to develop recommendations. So again, it's in the form of a report on evaluating sensor performance. We are initially focusing on fine particulate matter and ozone sensors. We're using a single tier for recommended target values, so these apply across all applications rather than targets for specific applications. Our focus here is on what we're calling NSIM applications. These are non-regulatory supplemental and informational monitoring applications. This is specifically focused on ambient outdoor fixed site environments. And lastly, we decided to pursue a voluntary approach rather than certification. So a summary of our results, we ended up developing 2 reports. Again, these outline recommended performance testing protocols, metrics, and target values for air sensors. We are focusing on ozone and PM2.5, and that's because they are widely used, and the understanding of the technologies is a little bit greater, and also the data availability. And our goal overall is to provide a consistent approach for performance testing of sensors and also reporting the results. And this is ultimately to help users identify sensors that meet their needs. And you can see the 2 report links are listed on this slide as well. The intended audience of this report are testing organizations, sensor manufacturers, and sensor developers. So as an overview of the reports, the general layout, we decided to make this similar across the reports, and there's 4 different sections. So first we have introduction that gives some background, motivation, and objectives. The second section provides the testing protocols, and these are step-by-step instructions for setting up testing, for actually conducting the testing and data collection. The third section is on performance metrics, and these are recommended metrics and also detailed instructions, formulas, etc. on how to calculate and report these metrics. And the last section is target values. These are our recommended targets for each sensor performance metric, and that helps to gauge air sensor performance. In addition, we also have appendices, and these provide things such as definitions, supporting information for all the recommendations. We have checklists for data collection and also reporting templates. And you can see the table below on this slide that summarizes that information. There are 8 different appendices, as you can see. So in addition to this reports, we have also provided fillable reporting templates, and these are in the form of PowerPoint files. And we're hoping that these can help facilitate documentation of test results. So the focus and applications of the reports, as I mentioned earlier, we're focused on the ambient outdoor fixed site environment and NCEM applications for these particular reports. And as you can see, we have 3 categories defined: spatial temporal variability, which is looking at characterizing pollutant levels over either geographic area or time. And you can see some of the examples here: daily trends, air quality forecasting, citizen science, education. The next category is comparison, and this is looking at differences or similarities in different air pollution characteristics against some value. And this could be across a network, a location, time period, what have you. And some examples of this are supplementary monitoring, hotspot detection, data fusion, and what have you. And the last category is long-term trend, and this is looking at changes in the pollutant concentration over a period of usually over a year. And specific examples include long-term changes, EPI studies, and model verification. So with that, I'm now going to turn this over to Andrea, who's going to go through the testing protocols, metrics, and target values. So Andrea.
Thanks, Rochelle. So as Rochelle mentioned, the reports outline 2 different testing protocols. One we consider base testing, and this is focused on evaluating air sensors in the field. And the second is called enhanced testing, and this involves evaluating sensors in a laboratory environment. So for base testing, what we're doing is we're taking the sensors out into the field and evaluating how they work in the ambient outdoor environment where they're in a fixed or stationary position. So the purpose here is to help us learn how the sensor performs in a real world environment. So what happens when they're exposed to a mixture of pollutants that we find in the real world, experience fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity, just like they would if we wanted to deploy these for some sort of research study or just to measure air quality in our communities. And this really helps to provide the consumer information about how they can expect that sensor to perform when they want to go make measurements in a very similar environment. But we know that we can't always capture a good variability in temperature, relative humidity, or pollutant concentration in the ambient. And sometimes it's important to test these sensors and how they might perform under different circumstances. So what happens if the pollutant concentration was much higher? What happens if it was much colder? Things like that. So that's why we're encouraging also the testing of sensors in the laboratory environment, where we deploy sensors in an exposure chamber. And this really helps us evaluate how the sensor will respond over a wider range of conditions that are just hard to capture in the field environment. At a minimum, we are really encouraging testers to conduct the base testing that can be relatively simple compared to the enhanced testing. We realize that the enhanced testing can be more difficult because it does require a controlled laboratory exposure chamber, which can be inaccessible for some users or testers. Next slide. So let's just go over the base testing protocol very quickly. So for one, we are encouraging that people deploy 3 identical air sensors. This gives us a sense of how the sensors perform out of the box. If you were just to buy one at random, how can you expect that to perform? And what is the variability if you were to purchase several of the sensors? We want to evaluate those as co-located with federal reference method or federal equivalent method monitors. These are what we consider the gold standard at US EPA. So we want to make sure that the sensors perform similarly. That's the goal. We want to set up these sensors at field sites where they're co-located. So a tester may choose to set up their own ambient monitoring site where they set up FRM or FEM technologies in an outdoor ambient setting. Or they may choose to establish collaborations with willing state, local, or tribal air monitoring agencies that already use these technologies and already collect high quality data. And it will be up to the tester to determine which path is best for them. We want to co-locate those sensors for at least 30 consecutive days and collect all of that information. And we want to do this at least twice. So we're recommending 2 field deployments. And the idea with 2 field deployments is we want to see how sensors perform under a variety of pollutant concentrations, temperature, and relative humidity conditions. And in order to get a good spread of these variables, we need to either measure them in 2 different locations or 2 different times of year. And to help testers figure out when they should do these tests or where they should do these tests, we have provided some recommendations to help find ideal locations, as you can see in the table below. Next slide. So Rochelle outlined that in section 2 of the report, we actually go through the base testing and we instruct people how to conduct this test. And along the way, we also make recommendations about what kind of information should be recorded so that it can be reported. At the end of the reports, we also provide a reporting template, which is available as a fillable PowerPoint file as well to make that easier for testers. So the idea here, this is an example of the ozone reporting template. On the first page, we have a number of details about the field deployment. So again, we've reminded people what they should record as they're going along to make sure that we can fill in this template. We think that there's a lot of value in being able to see the data. So we want to make sure that we encourage people to plot some of the data, including just a time series plot or a scatter plot. And you can see that here on page 1 of the report. And so we're encouraging this in addition to just the metrics and the numbers. So for instance, one of the things that we asked people to report is the slope of the regression between the sensor and the reference. So we'll get a number from that, but if we can see the scatter plot, we'll get a lot more information. So we're encouraging both pieces of information to be put in the template. We also have a place where we can see those metrics in relationship to the target values. And so in the third section of this first page, you can see some gray areas. Those are where the target is. We want the number to fall within this space. And so if we can plot it here, we get an idea of if we're within the target or how close we are to the target. The second page really asks to summarize all those performance statistics that are outlined in the third section of the report. We actually tell people how to calculate these things so that you can do that and fill in the report. And the last page of the report talks about some of the supplemental material that you may want to include to help people understand the data that's presented. So just some ideas of what could be here. We ask people to tell us about how the reference instruments, the FRM or FEM quality instruments, were calibrated. How often did that happen? How were they quality checked? So here you can actually link to additional documents that talk about that process, or you can just attach the calibration certificate here so that we know how that instrument was running. We also encourage people to talk to us about how sensor data may have been processed, because we know that some sensors actually collect raw data and they do some sort of calculation in order to produce concentrations. Sometimes that's a real black box to users, and really we want to encourage people to be more transparent. So having some sort of narrative about that process could be included in the supplemental materials here. Next slide. So this slide actually shows you a very similar template for PM2.5 sensors, and you can see that it looks a little bit different, but contains a lot of the same information. So again, we take the details that we recorded in section 2, where we are following the base testing reports, we add that here. We perform the metrics, we do the calculations, we record that here. And then we can see how our data compares to the target values by comparing to the numbers that are in this table. Next slide. So having talked about the base testing, we'll move on to talk about the enhanced testing. And again, we're actually encouraging testing of sensors in a controlled laboratory environment. Very similar to the base testing protocol, we're encouraging testers to test 3 identical air sensors because we know that there could be some variation between them. And then we want to evaluate how the sensors perform when they are exposed to a variety of pollutant concentrations at various temperature and relative humidity levels. So here in the table, you can see a little bit of information kind of summarizing those levels. So a few things that we see here. One, for ozone sensors, we know that several sensors have interference from a number of different pollutants. So we're actually going to create an atmosphere with these interfering pollutants and see how the sensor performs. We're also going to test a couple of relative humidity set points, a couple of temperature set points, and then we're also going to monitor how the sensor performs over time to see if we can detect any drift in how a sensor performs from day 1 to day 60. We've seen from some previous work that sometimes you can get a baseline jump in a sensor performance, and so we're hoping that a test like this might be able to tell us if a sensor is prone to such drift or not. And then we're also going to test higher concentrations. So the one thing that you might note here is we're actually testing at a low, mid, and a high concentration set point. Sometimes we're actually testing at an even higher concentration. And these concentrations relate to the NACs. So these are points at which we really want to know if that concentration is accurate so that we can inform the public and the community about the appropriate health messaging associated with that pollutant concentration. And I will note that for PM2.5 sensors, we actually did set a higher concentration range. And this is really relevant for wildfire smoke impacts. We know that a lot of people want to use air sensors to monitor for wildfire smoke. We know that sometimes these concentrations can get very high, and it is important to understand how the sensor might perform in that type of an environment. Next slide. So similar to the base testing template, we also have one for enhanced testing. This particular template that I show here is for ozone sensors. We can see on the first page, we have some information about the testing details. So what instruments were used, how often were they calibrated, things like that. Our second page, we talk about the effective relative humidity and temperature on the measurement of the sensors. And then on page 3, we talk about how that sensor may have drifted over time. And we also look at the accuracy at the even higher concentration range. Next slide. And this template is for the PM2.5 report for enhanced testing. You can see this one looks a little bit different than the ozone, and this is really because it does not include the interference testing that we needed to do for ozone sensors. Next slide. So as Rochelle mentioned, the fourth section of the report talks about the recommended target values. So I think that there is the main goal of providing a target value is to try to elevate the performance of sensors that are on the market today. We know that in general, people want sensors to provide as accurate of data as possible. And one way that we could do this is by setting a target to say, when you compare sensor data to a regulatory method, so an FRM or an FEM, we would like you to be this close to accurate. So the first line here talks about the precision. So the first thing we want to know, those 3 sensors that are being operated in triplicate, how well does that data agree with one another? It's really important that we get that as tight as possible. So we have some targets about how tight that should be. The next section talks about the bias or the slope in the intercept. When we compare the sensors to the reference, are they showing us the same thing or are they slightly different? We want to encourage them to measure the same thing as much as possible. So we put some bounds on that relationship. Next, we're talking about linearity. So when we compare the sensor to the reference, a lot of people talk about the R-squared value, or how linear is this data and how does it compare. So we have a bound for R-squared. And the last metric we have here is an estimate of the error associated with the measurement. In the literature, there are a lot of different ways in which people try to quantify the error. And for this application, we chose just one of those options, the RMSE, or the root mean square error. And we have some recommendations for how close or how small that error should be. I will note that for PM2.5 sensors, we did also include an RMSE, or the normalized root mean squared error, as an available metric. And this is really to speak to the idea that sensors may be used in high concentration environments like wildfire smoke. And in this case, we might expect some more variability, and it will be easier to quantify through the normalized root mean squared error. So these target values were set by considering a lot of the literature that's out there right now. So looking at people who have tried to apply sensor technologies for a variety of NSIM applications, we asked what kind of data quality did they need? What was adequate for these types of applications? And we also asked ourselves, what is reasonably achievable by technology at this time? So as we looked across the board, currently we've found several sensors that don't meet all of these criteria, but it does seem like in a very short amount of time, many of the sensors could be brought to achieve many of these targets. Lastly, we do recommend a couple of other things. One is some exploratory graphs that help to understand the potential impacts of temperature and relative humidity and dew point on the performance of sensors. So there's no target for these, but rather we just want to have some graphs to help us understand what the influences might be. And there are no target values for the enhanced testing protocols. Instead, we want testers just to report the results. And I think that just reporting the results will actually help us get a big handle on where technology is now. Next slide. So a few important reminders and notes about these testing protocols. One, these reports provide recommendations for evaluating sensor performance. They are entirely voluntary and they do not constitute certification or endorsement by EPA. EPA does not provide funding to conduct these tests, and we really encourage testers to share the results on their respective websites and to provide them along with the spec sheets to potential consumers. These reminders and a number of answers to other frequently asked questions can be found on our website. So if you go to the Air Sensors Toolbox, you can actually follow this link to find those frequently asked questions. But if you don't have time to write that down, I'll just say visit the Air Sensors Toolbox. You can Google that, you'll find it. And the banner on the page is for the performance testing protocols. So you'll find this page pretty quickly. Next slide. Now, although these protocols are voluntary, we do think that they are valuable, and we hope that a number of testers will adopt them and to start reporting the results accordingly. And really, we see that there's a lot of value in providing or testing sensors using a consistent approach. We also think that there's a lot of value in reporting the results in a consistent way, because that can really help consumers better understand sensor performance and the data quality that's provided by sensors. It can also help them make informed decisions when they're trying to choose an air sensor that's appropriate for their intended application. And we really hope that this work and kind of stacking up the results of an evaluation to these targets will help encourage innovation and product improvement in the marketplace. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Rochelle to wrap up today. And Rochelle, you're on mute. Rochelle, let me help you out here for a second. So let's just go quickly through some of the take-home messages. The reports that we have developed and have provided, we hope provide some much needed guidance to evaluating PM 2.5 and ozone air sensor performance. The target values that we've recommended should provide a benchmark for sensor performance and encourage some improvement in currently available sensor technology. And we really hope that the results will help consumers have more confidence in the quality of data that come from lower cost sensors and will help them to make informed decisions when they choose sensors. And hopefully they'll be able to find sensors that are best suited for their intended application. I do want to note here at the bottom that the reports and links to the reporting templates can be found at this website on the Air Sensors Toolbox. Next slide. So as you may have noticed, we've been very specific that the reports that we've developed are for PM 2.5 and ozone sensors. And we intend to reevaluate the recommendations that we made, especially for the target values, as more knowledge is gained and more experience is gathered about the use of these protocols. And we do anticipate that we'll be able to provide similar reports with the same application focus, that is ambient outdoor fixed site applications and some applications for sensors for other pollutants. Right now, we're working on those reports for PM10, NO2, CO, and SO2 sensors. And these reports will be informed by a second workshop that was held in 2019 and another literature review that was done at nearly the same time. Next slide. And with that, we really want to point you to the available resources. Updates on sensor performance, testing protocols, metrics, and targets will be posted to the Air Sensors Toolbox. As a reminder, that page for the targets also links to frequently asked questions. I do anticipate that we'll be updating that page after seeing some of the questions that have come in during today's webinar. So you can look for that in the future as well. But the Air Sensors Toolbox website provides a lot of other information that you might find helpful if you are interested in using low-cost sensors for a variety of applications. Next slide. And with that, we just want to give you our contact information. So if you have further questions, you can reach out to us at any point. And hopefully we can get Rochelle's mic back on for our question and answer session. Thank you so much for joining us today.